The US government says that a family of four can get by on $32,000 a year. That is the government-recognized poverty line. But even if you make that much as a single person, you know intuitively that that feels like you're just scraping by. Today's show brings Mike Green, the CIO of Simplify Asset Management, on to discuss his viral and divisive essay that proposed the new poverty line should really be $140,000 a year. This has erupted a ton of controversy across the internet from the right and the left, and Mike joined us today to answer his critics, explain the math behind the issue he's addressing, and tell us where we're going next. I think everyone should listen to this conversation start to finish. I learned a ton speaking with Mike, and I think you will too. Mike, it is great to have you back on the show. A lot has changed since the last time you were on. You've written a very viral, very controversial essay that essentially laid out the poverty line in America is closer to $140,000 than the government proposed $32,000. There's something going on here. Can you help us explain that gap in the middle?
Well, I think, first of all, the most important thing is to recognize that I just got bored of writing about passive, right? So it wasn't like I tried to actually write something that went viral, et cetera. As I got drawn into some of these conversations about inequality and the changing perception of access that exists, particularly amongst the younger generation, you have two ways of dealing with it. You can return to the official data and be like, oh, poverty's falling, it's not a big deal, et cetera, everything's fine. Or you can do what has consistently paid off in my career, which is actually challenge the status quo and basically say, well, wait a second, if that many people are complaining about something and saying something, let's try to understand the perspective. And so that really was the genesis. As you saw it on my Substack, it initially went from identifying the mocking machine that was effectively taking the concerns that people had at the lower income levels and expressing them in the form of, we can't afford houses, right? We can't afford to start our families. We can't afford to do these things. And beginning asking questions around, okay, well, why are they saying this given that the official statistics suggest the opposite? It was not an intent to go out and become a poverty expert or the leading authority on anything. And by the way, that's exactly how it was with passive. It was really just trying to understand what was actually going on in that framework that ultimately led me to understand that the conventional thinking on it was wrong. Unfortunately, in this case, it's the same. So the definition of the poverty line for a family of four, 2 income earners, 2 children is roughly $32,000. The way that's derived is using an archaic formula from 1963 in which they tripled the USDA minimum food budget. That minimum food budget, by the way, many people will point to it and say, well, this is not accurate, and the multipliers, et cetera. That was a misunderstanding on their part. That minimum food budget did not include dining out, et cetera. In 1969, that was adopted as the official level, and we simply took that number and then inflated it by CPI on a continuous basis. As early as 1966, the original author of the poverty line, Molly Orshansky, was recognizing that it no longer actually met the criteria for identifying a family that was in true crisis, which was her initial intention, that food prices had fallen relative to many other ancillary costs that people were forced to take on. And so she was not actually a proponent of it. But for politically convenient reasons, it became very easy to adopt that level and then simply adjust it by CPI because that's the official inflation metric. There's a couple of things that then played out, right? So that policy line number is primarily used for the identification of where you need to receive benefits. And if you are at $32,000 in income as a family of four with 2 children and 2 income earners, you're going to qualify for significant benefits. Those benefits contribute to what's called the supplemental poverty measure, which is a measure that says after they receive all the benefits on a tax-adjusted basis, are they still in crisis? What fraction of people meet that threshold? That's what the supplemental poverty measure is. I may be slightly off on this, but I believe that the official number is only 1.4% of American households are in crisis, according to the supplemental poverty measures. The problem, of course, is that we also get statistics that say that 59% of American households can't meet a $1,000 unexpected line item on their budget, right? An emergency expenditure. And so there's got to be something going on in that chasm that is ultimately occurring. And that really is what I identified in that piece, this concept of benefit cliffs, or as I described it, and I think it's far more prosaic, a valley of death, basically between about $40,000 in income and roughly $100,000 in income, in which the rate of income gain barely or doesn't offset the rate of benefit withdrawal. And so if you're a family of four making $40,000, you receive that package of benefits that's worth roughly $50,000 after tax. That suggests to you that the number is somewhere in the $90,000 range. But on your transition to that $90,000, you get those benefits taken away. So every dollar of incremental earnings that you make is going to replace the lost benefits. It's not like you get to skip childcare because you're suddenly making more money. The reality is you're probably working harder in a job with more responsibility, and you need even more childcare than you were receiving before. So these criteria and these characteristics playing through are creating this valley of death that particularly young people who are confronting the choice of, do I go from a single individual making, let's say, $80,000, my life is okay, I can live at home, I can, reduce my expenses in a variety of ways, I can choose not to dine out, even though dining out sometimes is economically more efficient than cooking for a single person. All of those things are choices that you make, and you continue to have some discretionary income. As you confront that transition, getting married, having children, et cetera, those don't naturally come with more income. Right? The only way getting married comes with more income is if your spouse works. Having additional children doesn't create additional income. It simply creates additional expense and demands on your time, reducing your leisure quantity. And if you're confronting that and the reality of that transition is such that you find yourself significantly worse off, and more importantly, you recognize that you can't provide adequately for that child to have a chance of superior success going forward. In other words, buying into the option of the American dream for your child, you choose not to have the child. And that's what we're seeing. And that's why it's creating crisis, particularly for the Gen Zers who are now approaching that transition. The millennials, I think you see a little bit less of it. They already made those choices. In most situations, the millennials are now aging out of the decision time period to have children, or the last of them are confronting it. I believe most people would cut off millennials around 1995. The oldest millennials at this point are now approaching that 40 threshold. 30. The oldest millennials are past the 40 threshold. The youngest millennials are approaching that 30 threshold. At which the reality is if they don't form households, if they don't have children in the next 10 years, the odds are very high they're not going to.
All the young people I have shared this essay with and shared the data with have told me, wow, this really speaks to me. This resonates. I feel the affordability pinch. I'm nervous about having kids, starting a family, because costs are so prohibitive for childcare, healthcare, housing. And I totally understand that. The older Americans I've shared it with mostly dismiss the math.
Yep.
They say, something's got to be off here. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but this feels a little extreme, the $140,000 poverty line. Can you explain that, maybe that generational gap on criticism for this essay?
Well, first of all, it's natural to criticize the young, right? So in my most recent piece, I highlighted that, as early as Socrates, there were complaints about, the deleterious and depraved nature of youth. As I pointed out in my piece, it didn't work out very well for Socrates. I doubt it's going to work out particularly well for the boomers. But the simple reality is that you, as a younger generation, are confronting costs that many of them never even considered. The idea that childcare could be the largest line item on the budget of a young family is something that most boomers can't even, they just can't even conceptualize it. Right. And even within that, the cohort of those who can begin to conceptualize it, you also find advice that basically boils down to, well, you should move to a place like Nebraska where those costs are going to be significantly less, or you should choose to live near your parents, right, without fully appreciating that then is typically locking you into even higher housing costs because you're moving into an area that has been very developed over the past, give or take, 50 years. So, I don't blame them for not understanding or not necessarily accepting it, because it's a little bit like saying, well, you need a cell phone, right? A boomer can correctly look at that and say, well, you don't need a cell phone, right? But without a cell phone, you don't have access to banking apps. You don't have access to your brokerage accounts. You don't have access to FaceTime that's required for you to work jobs that increasingly are 24/7 in their access characteristics. You no longer can take advantage of the social apps that allow you to coordinate with your friends, et cetera. Effectively, without a smartphone, you become a social pariah. right? And so the reality is, do you need it? No, but we also don't need, 2x4 framed housing. We could theoretically still live in caves. It's just the natural occurrence of caves is very, very low. And as a result, it's not a realistic assessment.
I think that's amazingly pointed and fair to say all of that. And yet critics will still come back to your piece. They'll still come at you online. And mostly, I think Ivory Tower economists, Ivory Tower academics have really taken almost offense at your piece, I think. And they say, oh, the Valley of Death is overstated. The benefits that you're alluding to are not expensive as you lay out. Why do you think the criticism has, I think, come predominantly from these elite institutions?
Well, I think that there's two separate components to it. And I think this is actually indicative of many of the challenges that we're going to see over the next few years. First of all, as I indicated, there was legitimate criticism coming from the left. There was some concerns that were expressed on the right that I would characterize as somewhat legitimate. And by and large, I corrected those by the time the second piece came out. So again, I had no intention for this to go viral. It was an outgrowth of a prior piece I'd written about the mockery machine and this tendency for people to effectively try to humiliate people into not complaining, right? For those of you who have read Animal Farm or who have read 1984, that type of behavior is very common within the overlord class to basically prevent dissent or discussion, right? That piece was focused on Essex County, New Jersey, because of a declaration made by somebody criticizing the lament that people can no longer afford houses, to say, hey, if you were to move to the modest, region of America that my grandparents grew up in, you could continue to afford it. Now, it was written by somebody who was expatriated to Europe and really didn't understand it. And so I was able to quickly eviscerate that claim and point out that, his articulation was fundamentally flawed, that over 60% of the household income of the person that he identified as his grandfather would go to simply paying the property taxes on that property, right? Just absolutely absurd when you think about it. But I allowed that piece to carry over into the next one. And so I presented Essex County, New Jersey, which is actually relatively affluent and relatively unaffordable versus other areas of the country. So that 140,000 is a bit high on a nationwide basis. Now, the most typical, right, the most common in terms of all the coefficients of well-being and cost of living, et cetera, city in the country is Lynchburg, Virginia. There, the number would work out to about $95,000, a little bit more than $95,000. And again, these are 2024 costs, so they're not inflated for inflation. It's going to be slightly more than 96 today. That's still so laughably far from that 32 that it's kind of silly. The second thing is this continual obsession that comes from the Ivory Tower. And I hate to say this in any manner that is offensive, but it's a simple reality. You don't find yourself an Ivory Tower academician by virtue of being a genius. The reality is that you're a midwit, right? You're slightly smarter than average. You are not an extreme outlier, because if you were, you would have pursued any number of much more profitable and much more rewarding goals. At a think tank, by and large, you are submitting to your masters who are compensating you under lobbying frameworks. And as a result, many of the components that need to be challenged weren't challenged by these academicians. Things like a differential inflation rate between the poor and the wealthy, deeply, deeply misunderstood, right? It's presented as if, the poor are doing better because on inflation adjusted terms, they're doing better. The reality is that misunderstands the mechanisms behind CPI and the inclusion of new products and hedonic adjustments that reward quality. Wealth equates to freedom. It gives you the freedom to decide to buy luxuries. As those luxuries become more commonplace through the advance of technology, they naturally diffuse through society, becoming something like a smartphone that ultimately becomes mandatory for even those at the low end to own. In the CPI adjustment process, the early adopters to cell phones are the ones who actually benefit from that, the rich, right? They see their cost of cell phones and the features included in the cell phones that they're already purchasing declining. For those at the lower end of the spectrum, they see the utility of the traditional product declining, even as they're not able to initially afford the smartphone. So they see the landline that used to be enough to allow you to respond to a job interview or to conduct your banking operations or stay in touch with people even networks, informal networks, where a single landline in a grouping of houses could be used by the unaffordable people who could turn to their neighbors and say, hey, I've got a phone call coming in. Can I use your phone? Right? You really can't do that with smartphones. They're personalized to a degree that if your friend were to ask you if they could borrow your smartphone for a day, you'd be like, no. It's like, you're my best friend, but I'm not giving you my smartphone for the day. Right? And so those informal networks also go away. And so they actually experience increasing prices. And the empirical evidence behind this is very, very clear. Those at the lower end, even in the low inflationary period from give or take 2010 until 2022, we saw their cost of living, their inflation adjustment at about 0.6 over the overall average, which is about 1.7. Right. So they were experiencing 2.3% inflation. The aggregate was experiencing 1.7. The wealthy were experiencing less than 1.5% inflation. That unfortunately means that the value of those benefits and the point at which those benefits kick in over a cumulative period of time have degraded significantly. And so, like, if anything, I'm just disappointed by the quality of the arguments coming from the right. I think they're terrible.
Some of you may not have heard this, but our partners at Public just launched something called Generated Assets. It brings AI into investing in a way I've honestly not seen before. Here's how it works. You type in an idea like AI-powered supply chain companies with positive free cash flow, or something like defense tech companies growing revenue over 25% year over year. Public's AI then dispatches a swarm of agents that can scan every single stock, evaluate them, and instantly build a custom index around your thesis. What really stands out is how clearly it explains why each stock is included. And before you invest, you can even backtest your idea against the S&P 500, so you're making decisions with real context and not just guessing. Beyond generated assets, Public lets you invest in stocks, bonds, options, crypto, all in one place. They'll even give you an uncapped 1% match when you transfer your investments over from another platform. If you want to build a portfolio that actually reflects your thesis, visit public.com/openingbell. That's public.com/openingbell. Now let's get back to the conversation. I think one of the most common one-liners I've seen online about this piece, people say you're conflating not being rich with being poor. What do you make of that? I think there is some truth to that claim. I actually never asserted that this was the demarcation of poverty per se. What I actually articulated was the demarcation of precarity and participation. So if you are going to be an active member of society, if you're going to have that cell phone, if you're going to take a job, if you're going to live in a region that gives you access to jobs, this is an accurate description of what that number is. If you're below that, you're either receiving some benefits or you're constantly struggling with, how do I put any money away? This is why we see the statistics emerging simultaneously with the claim that only 1.6% of US households are in poverty when adjusted for the supplemental poverty measure, with things like the 59% of households can't meet $1,000 unexpected expense. That is telling you that this analysis is correct, and it's the economists that are wrong. Right? The reality is, yes, there's all sorts of sacrifices that you could make to increase your savings between roughly $50,000 and $140,000. But the other reality is, if you are going to conduct life, if you're actually going to live, and Adam Smith used to describe poverty as being unashamed to show up in public, being unashamed to participate in public life. That was his definition of it. At his core, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher who described poverty as something that needed to be avoided so that people could be active participants in society. I will stand by that 100,000 in Lynchburg, Virginia, and 140,000 in Essex County, New Jersey, for a dual income family with 2 children until I'm blue in the face. And I think the data certainly support that position as far as my understanding of it. You talk about this concept of a ghost household. And from my understanding, this is a consequence of people not having kids. Birth rates are coming down. People can't afford to have kids, or they're finding financial reasons to not create a family. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. So this is unfortunately, again, one of the byproducts of many of the assumptions we make in economics, right? We refer to homo rationalis economicus, this idea that at their core, human beings are rational participants. And so the idea is very straightforward, that what you're actually doing with your choices is you are revealing preferences, right? So if I choose not to have a family, that is a revealed preference that I value my independence, that I value the opportunities that are created by not forming a family as somehow superior to those that I would face if I did otherwise. Now, there's a number of problems with that. There can be constraints around behaviors, right? My revealed preference could be to break the law, but I am fearful of law enforcement. Therefore, I don't do it. It has absolutely nothing to do with my preference. It has to do with the reality that the consequences associated with my preference are high enough. This is very similar in its framework. One of the responses from the right is, well, the median household income for those with 2 income earners and 2 children is actually $148,000, and therefore this is not really the problem that he's presenting. There's 2 ways you can arrive at that population. One is by virtue of everybody magically getting more money by having 2 kids, right? I've never seen that happen. Unless your child is a child actor, right? And then you become an abusive parent and all sorts of weird things happen to your kid, and you don't really want that either. But the flip side of that equation is you can also create that distribution by having those who are below that level choose not to make that choice in household formation, choosing not to get married, choosing not to form a household, choosing not to have children. So they never enter that distribution.
So the data is skewed.
The distribution of observed outcomes is meaningfully skewed. It'd be the same thing as if we raised minimum wage to $50 an hour. Suddenly, average wage would rise dramatically. So would unemployment.
I think one concern folks on the right have talked about is, okay, if all this is true, the solution, one solution you could arrive at is we need to significantly increase government subsidies and government help for a huge swath of the American public. But I don't think that's the proposal that you're suggesting in your analysis.
Well, I think this is one of the frustrations, right? So those on the left naturally sought me out for commentary because they saw an ally emerging from the right that basically said something that could be interpreted in that manner, right? The natural incentive from those on the left is to say we need to expand the services and support for these individuals, and this is how we should spend the money, right? That's the natural bias of the left. At its core, it is a control-oriented architecture built around central planning philosophy, and the idea being, well, we should absolutely support childcare, therefore we're going to subsidize childcare. We should absolutely support superior education, therefore we're going to offer subsidies for charter schools. We should absolutely support these things, therefore we're going to do X, Y, and Z, right? That to me is an incredibly inelegant solution, and it's why I naturally ally myself more with those who end up on the right, who are proponents of the idea of capitalism, which is that money is ultimately a tool for information exchange. It allows me to communicate demand. It allows me to communicate, is there a profitable investment opportunity to expand supply? And so my bias would be very straightforward. You simply expand the earned income tax credit and give more cash to these households. It's an effective tax cut for those at the lower end, or more accurately, the middle of the American distribution, that allows them to express their preferences in a manner that are unconstrained by government fiat. So
Can you explain that a bit more? Walk us through the tax.
Yeah. So imagine you make $60,000, and instead of paying net tax, you actually end up receiving a tax refund. You have to participate. You have to work, right? You have to be involved in the system, and yet you're actually receiving a net tax benefit. You're getting a negative tax rate. That's what the earned income tax was originally predicated on. It was built on Milton Friedman's philosophies, which I abhor in most frames, but ultimately this is a very valid one, in which you're simply saying, I don't know exactly how you as an individual family need to spend the money. You may need more housing support. You may need more childcare support. You may need more healthcare support. But instead of directing the money there, which immediately results in inflation in areas where you are directing money in which there's an existing shortage and very little incentive to ameliorate that, because you simply then inflation adjust that benefit, right? So you don't introduce lower cost supply. Instead, you give cash and you allow the market to compete for that cash. You allow those households to direct that cash in a manner that they would like to. That is what allows revealed preferences, which is what capitalism is all about. the information content of how dollars are spent.
Well, I like that a lot. I think the instinct or maybe the natural reaction to this would be, let's build a bunch of low-income housing or a bunch of high rises that are affordable for more people. But that doesn't seem like it's going to solve the systemic issue.
Yeah, that's a central planning approach, right? That's okay, there's a problem in housing, therefore we're going to build more housing. Well, how do you know that it's the housing that is actually needed? How do you know it's in the areas that you're building housing in areas that it's actually needed? The only way you do that is through a capitalist system of information exchange, right? That's why Adam Smith viewed capitalism as a moral philosophy. It was the tool that allowed the greatest information quantity per unit of dollars spent. If it's being dictated by an emperor, it has no bearing on the lived experience, I hate to use a woke term, but the lived experience of, your typical individual. It's directed by the emperor saying, wouldn't this be nice? Right? And that's being whispered in his ear by his advisors. His advisors are inherently corrupt and tied into businesses that are providing childcare services in Minnesota, right? That type of framework is what leads to what we're experiencing in Minnesota. Just give people cash and let them spend the money and respect their choices. If they make bad choices, they will have bad outcomes relative to those who make good choices. Your question then is, what do we do and what level do we set the benefits that allow people to be bailed out? And people are understandably terrified of that discussion because it does require you to trust people and it does require you to believe in people. On the left, they don't believe in people. They think they're stupid, right? They need to have it directed. On the right, they don't believe in people. They think they're stupid. If they were smart, the right's view is they would be successful and we wouldn't be having this conversation. There's no consideration across either side that maybe it's actually the design of the system that is contributing to the observed results.
Well, I think a lot of people will point to, let's say, the 140,000 mark and say, this is a behavioral issue or a budgeting problem. Like, these people are not rational enough or disciplined enough to budget their monthly expenses to, do all sorts of things. Maybe they're spending it on Netflix or Rolex or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're spending it on Rolex, obviously, you're making bad choices. Not only is it a unattractive design, but it's also mechanically inferior. Again, there is an element of you have to trust people that is made more difficult in a heterogeneous community in which particularly older people look at the younger people receiving these benefits and say they don't look like us, right? There is a degree that is embedded in that. There's also just a degree of people being unwilling to actually take the risk because they see it as a zero-sum arrangement. That's particularly true on the right, where, again, this obsession with meritocracy and efficiency has a neo-Calvinist framing to it. I'm rich because I deserve to be as one of God's selected few. What's your evidence that you're one of God's selected few? Well, I'm rich, right? It's a self-congratulatory message. It was actually very well articulated in 1958 by Michael Young in a book called The Rise of the Meritocracy, which was a parody or a dystopian future analysis of what happens when you have a purely meritocratic system in which effectively, genetic endowments, I'm smarter, I'm more capable, are quickly replaced by actually the transmission of those benefits in the form of superior education, credentialism, growing up in the right neighborhood, making the right connections, et cetera, that become very much like an aristocracy. Unlike an aristocracy, which has had a long history of noblesse oblige, a recognition from those who governed that they were put there effectively with an obligation to take care of people. Michael Young's observation was if that emerged under a meritocratic framework, it became much more, we are deserving of this and they are undeserving of it. And that, unfortunately, I think is really where the dialogue exists today, that we have a wealthy class that ultimately thinks the solution is to give them even more resources because they are the ones that know how to productively deploy it.
Wow. What do you see if nothing changes over the next 5 or 10 years? What are the socioeconomic repercussions of that?
Well, the biggest one is effectively tied to this time value component, right? And so this is, you've heard me talk about this before in economics. The core of Homo rationalis economicus is that you're going to always make the higher expected value trade on a current utility framework. That, unfortunately, is a system that doesn't recognize the reality that human beings are not a commodity. Gold in a warehouse remains gold 50 years from now. Its optionality is unchanged. Human beings progress linearly through time. If I'm 20 years old, I can begin to consider the formation of a family. This is particularly true for women, and it's one of the reasons why I think actually these concerns are increasingly being elevated, because women in particular sit at the core of these issues. They've been empowered in our society. I think that's an important feature of it. But the simple reality is that if you're a 20-year-old female, you can begin the contemplation of family formation. Once you become a 40-year-old female, you can no longer realistically consider that. There are expensive interventions, IVF, et cetera, that can potentially expand that to 45. But beyond that level, we really have no capacity for you to make that choice again. And as a result, that time value, that period between 20 and 45, is unique in your history in that it's going to radically affect future outcomes in a way that almost nothing else does. I can always go back to college, right? Am I going to face some disadvantages and higher opportunity costs associated with it? Absolutely. Can I go back at 55 and decide, gosh, I really wish I'd had children? It's very, very hard to do that. Now, traditional economics has a very poor record of dealing with these types of choices. Right? One way to think about it is effectively a discount rate factor goes up during these time periods that basically says the future value of that has been reduced. That is a very poor tool for analyzing it. Instead, you need to turn to some of the newer models of economics that are built not on aggregate formation or dynamic stochastic general equilibriums, but instead built on agentic models in which many of those agents face these types of time-based constraints. That naturally leads you to non-ergodic solutions. In terms of the math that needs to be done, those really weren't available to us when we built a lot of the systems and rationale for this in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. We simply didn't have the computational capability. Today, we have that. It's emerging as what's called ergodicity economics. It's a recognition that a time series average is radically different than an ensemble average. And I think we've talked about this before, but just to articulate that in its simplest form, an ergodic system is one in which the time series average is the same as the ensemble average. If I roll a set of two six-sided die, right, so 36 possible combinations, 1,000 times, the distribution of outcomes, let's make it 10,000 to make it more realistic, the distribution of outcomes is going to be identical to 10,000 people rolling, nearly identical to the distribution of outcomes of 10,000 people rolling those same six-sided die at the same time. Think about that in investment terms. One person investing over 10,000 years, not possible, but understandable, or 10,000 periods, let's just make it that, is going to have a radically different outcome in terms of its distribution than 10,000 people all investing for the same period, right? Those differences really matter in the implementation of these types of problems that we encounter that have time definition to them. And as a result, many of the tools that we use are simply not fit for purpose. This is part of what crises are all about, right? Rahm Emanuel famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, that's what we did with 2008. We let a good crisis go to waste. We instead decided to paper over the problems that it revealed about aggregate demand and the source of that aggregate demand, and radically changed the structure of the financing to remove the potential for a bubble in mortgage financing. But in the process of doing so, effectively change the distribution of potential outcomes for those tied into a time-based system. That's manifesting itself in two ways. The ghost households, the lack of households that are being formed, which is going to contribute to lower fertility going forward and create conditions under which population begins to shrink. That has huge ramifications across a wide variety of areas, including, by the way, things like housing and childcare, because demand for those services declines if you have fewer houses and fewer households and fewer children. So it's a demand-based solution to it. The alternative is to start thinking about it in a much more holistic framework and actually thinking about it from an agentic framework and start building solutions that encourage the solution, the actual supply side solutions to those. That would be things like lowering the cost of permitting housing. Why does that matter? Well, the simple reality is that if the cost of permitting a house, which is a unit-based component, has a high share of the total cost, it's much more profitable for me to build a big luxury house than it is for me to build a small house, because I'm incurring basically the same permitting costs. I'm incurring the same land acquisition costs. I'm incurring the same financing costs. in many situations, the markup associated with the high luxury property is going to be significantly greater. Now, those houses will not be built in the areas that young families need them. They're not going to provide proximate access to public transportation or jobs. And so by creating those types of unitary barriers, we're short-circuiting the ability to provide meaningful solutions.
Real quick, we'll get right back to the interview. Just wanted to pop in and say, if you like this content, I write a newsletter every single morning called Opening Bell Daily. I cover macro, the stock market, asset prices, why things are going up, why they're going down. And if you want to get that for free, you can sign up at the link in the description. Let's get back to the interview. When I hear all of this and I read your work, a lot of it resonates with me, but I find it difficult to stomach as an optimist. What is the best case scenario that you see if we can take all these ideas and move forward as a society?
Well, I actually think, again, it's this same dynamic of ghost households. I think that there is an extraordinary level of ghost lost productivity, lost labor force participation, lost future revenues associated with young people being built, created, and future taxpayers emerging. So I ultimately think, I'm incredibly optimistic that eventually we will arrive at solutions that allow us to, again, return to replacement level fertility. There will be solutions around that, including expansion of IVF capability. What's Russell's last name? I'm blanking on it. Has written a series of pieces identifying the increased prevalence of IVF as one of the solutions to the demographic challenges. I actually agree with that. I think that part of what we'll end up seeing is household formation and family formation will have a longer time window. That's one of the ways of amortizing a higher cost of living component to it, cost of shelter and household formation. That also, in many ways, changes society in very predictable and sometimes unpredictable ways, right? If that is technology that is only available to wealthy individuals as it is today, it actually reduces the incentive to support broader solutions because they look at it and they're like, well, I don't care. I can have children at 45. I can freeze my eggs. I can do X, Y, Z, right? Those are all choices that are available to high income individuals. And again, to go back to the CPI component, if you were to include components like IVF, which by definition was largely only available to those with upper incomes or fantastic healthcare coverage, the cost has declined. That's reduced the barriers to IVF, and we've seen dramatically increased adoption of it amongst both wealthy individuals and lower income individuals. But the simple reality is it is an extraordinary cost and an extraordinary expense for many of those at the lower end of the spectrum, and they didn't benefit from the reduced cost that we saw over the last 30 years in IVF. They instead are looking at it and saying, well, I can choose to delay household formation and then incur a $50,000 or $100,000 or a $300,000 cost when I'm 45. But if that fails to emerge, then you're actually dealing with people who have been permanently impaired in terms of their outlook on society, and it contributes to the burn it down type framework. If you're 45 years old, you haven't formed a household, you haven't actually created children, you haven't created that forward-looking component, you can still be an incredibly productive member of society, but only if you're a conformist, right? If you're somebody who is inherently dissatisfied, it actually raises the prospects that you will instead become a reactionary and angry at the system. And that's really where systems start to break down. And that's my concern is that we've contributed to this by failure to address these things. We've been talking about deterioration in public education for 50 years. We've done almost nothing about it. We've talked about the challenges associated with housing for well over 30 years. That was momentarily interrupted by a financing bubble in the lead up to the global financial crisis. We then had components of housing surplus for the next 4 or 5 years. And now, unfortunately, those chickens are coming home to roost. Fighting those types of battles once the crisis has emerged sometimes is absolutely necessary. The simple reality is it's hard to get society focused on these things. It's far more productive to try to do it early.
Totally. When I talk to young people or I visit college campuses and meet students, the resounding sentiment is pessimistic.
Yeah.
And that's sad to me. It's unfortunate. When I was in college, I thought the future couldn't have been brighter. And I was very excited to get into the world and start doing something with my life. And I don't know if I sense that same vibe right now. The affordability is probably the crux of it, but I think with the pessimism, the affordability, that's what's resulting in this gradual shift among young people towards socialist tendencies.
Absolutely.
And beliefs. Troubles me. What do you think?
No, I think that's absolutely true. And I think, unfortunately, it is a byproduct, again, of the older generation not actually understanding the problem, not hearing the problem, seeing the official statistics that tell you we've never had it better, right? Simple reality is those younger people who have incurred incredible expenses that many of the older generation did not, overpriced education in the form of, college loans and student loan debt that has to be repaid, for degrees that offer an increasingly marginal benefit. The unemployment rate for those with college graduate degrees has roughly doubled in aggregate over the last 20 years. The degree of unemployment for those who are recent graduates has roughly quadrupled. And as a result, you're seeing more and more people say, well, it's just not worth it to go to college, right? It's not appropriate to do this. I actually just had a discussion with somebody about this yesterday, though, where it's just like they were told, learn to code 10 years ago, right? We created Girls Who Code as a byproduct of Larry Summers' inability to keep his mouth shut, et cetera. All of these things ultimately play through in the system. But the reality is that learning to code, now people are looking at it like, well, that was a waste, right? LLMs are taking my jobs, right? People who think that the future is in electricians and plumbing have not actually done the analysis. The wages of electricians and plumbers have failed to actually keep up with wages in the United States in total. What is happening, the reason why you see your plumber bill or your electrician bill so high, and why those who are currently owning their own business in HVAC or plumbing or electricians, they're benefiting effectively from a price umbrella that has been created by the horizontal acquisition from private equity in the space that has caused the prices of the service to rise significantly. But the actual employees, the electricians who are working for those companies, are experiencing degradations in their real incomes. And so there is no really great choice associated with this until we actually reform components of the system to rebalance the power between capital and labor. And that makes me sound like a socialist because I've introduced the two topics that ultimately Karl Marx focused on. But the simple reality is that capitalism, as it is built, that information exchange, allows the compounding of advantages that ultimately manifests itself in a hereditary or aristocratic type framework, as I mentioned, that is far more, abusive in its construction and its self-satisfied nature versus any sort of historical inherited aristocracy. Naturally, younger people, when confronted with a message from people saying, you've never had it better, and experiencing a life that doesn't even begin to approach what they had been led to believe it would when they secured all the credentials and made all the right steps that they were told to take, and by the way, worked far harder for it than I ever did, right? I like to joke, and I wrote about this in my last piece, the refrain that I have amongst my co-graduates from an Ivy League institution is, there's no chance we would get in today. Right? It's far more competitive. It's far more challenging. And by the way, by the time the kids make it out of that, they've in general, had no real work experience because they've had to spend all their time in tutoring or organized sports in order to gain a small advantage in an admission process. Where you look at a fine university like UCLA, when I applied to UCLA in 1987, the acceptance rate was nearly 70%. Today it's 7%. Right? Would I have made it into UCLA? I have no idea. I legitimately have no idea. Would I have made it into Penn? Almost certainly not, right? And the reality is that access to that education changed the trajectory of my life. It took me from growing up on a small farm where both my parents had to work. We ultimately lost the farm to property tax increases in California. That then created a portion of my childhood in which I was a latchkey kid responsible for navigating public transportation to get my sister and I home from school. My family made extraordinary investments in my education. My mother worked herself to the point that she literally broke down and became mentally unstable, but provided me with access to resources that allowed me to have that future life choice. I don't want to see other people forced through an environment in which their parents are driven to a mental breakdown in order to provide the resources that are necessary to thrive in society. And so I take that precarity line, that point at which people are experiencing mental stress associated with the decisions that they've made, and a genuine uncertainty about their ability to provide for their children as something very personal.
Mike, this is Unbelievable stuff. And I so appreciate you coming on the show to tell us all about it. So thank you for your time. And tell people where they can find you online.
It's easier to find me than to not find me at this point. On Twitter, I'm ProfPlum99. I don't look anything like my avatar. We've discussed that in the past. You can also find my stuff at the Simplify website, www.simplify.us. That's where our products are created for investment purposes, where we share some of our insights on financial markets. And then if you really want to rattle around in the attic that is my head, you can go to yesigiveafeg.com. That's my Substack and was the source of the papers that we're discussing. I always remind people that it's very, very reasonably priced. If you're a Simplify customer, there's an automatic 50% discount. You just have to claim it. And if you really, truly can't afford it, but you want to learn about this stuff, just reach out. I'm always happy to provide, access for free.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. We'll do it again.
Thank you very much, Phil.